Today on the Social Corner.
What happens in a lot of the time when it comes to black Christians, we're asked to leave behind our blackness and our black experience. But then you may find that people are not asked to leave behind their imperialistic or their empire view of Christianity.
Hello and welcome to the Social Corner with me, Daina Anderson Mpunzi. My guest today is a renowned speaker and leader, recognised in churches and communities nationally for his wisdom on topics such as leadership, personal development and well-being. He's the co-founder of national organisation Street Pastors, and as the director of Paideia Training and Consultancy, he's passionate about helping people confront their limitations and realise their full potential. It's a pleasure to have him here with me in the studio today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Reverend David Shosanya, is that right?
Yeah, but David's fine. It's a pleasure to be here.
I was going to say, because that's a mouthful. Welcome to the show. It's so great to have you.
Thank you very much. Lovely.
So, David, it's like I actually feel like I knew you before I knew you.
Yes.
And I will explain. So I'm going to rewind back to roughly about 2016, 2017. And I was Midlands producer for Premier Christian Radio.
Okay.
And Midlands and Wales producer. And I was doing a segment on community and stuff like that. So I was asked to cover the street pastors.
Yes.
And I remember travelling to Nottingham, meeting everyone. There was a brief, the police were there, a prayer, and then we went out on the street. And I really didn't know what to expect. And basically it was Club Central. And, you know, I was with a group of, I would say, everyday people who were just literally caring for people who, you know, were in a bit of an altered state and also, but I think what really struck me was the way everybody knew them. They were so welcomed. So I was like, what's this going to look like? A bunch of Christians walking through the city, but it was like, oh, hey guys, you know, the bouncers were really welcoming, the police, and even the party goers themselves. It was like a presence there that was, I would suppose, made them feel safe and comfortable.
Absolutely.
How does it feel to know that you co-founded an organisation like that that's now national across the country? Yeah,
that's a really interesting question. Do you know, it feels natural because I think it was the right thing to do. The whole Street Pastors initiative emerged out of a set of concerns that I had and Les Isaac had and Ian Critchlow, who was then at the time a detective constable with Operation Trident, which was the Metropolitan Police response to gun and knife crime. So Reverend Les Isaac went to Jamaica. And in Jamaica, he wanted to see what they were doing in Trenchtown and in other places like that to combat gun crime. I went off to America to meet a guy by the name of Eugene Rivers III, who launched one of the most effective intervention initiatives. And when we came back, we just began to have a conversation about the issues that were affecting our community. Particularly at that time, there was an increase in crack cocaine. And we know that there's a correlation with violence because people fight for turf and territory. And so we sat down in Leslie's front room and we just decided we need the church to be on the streets. And it seemed like a natural response to be where people were hurting, where people were vulnerable, to be where people needed hope, and to offer a non-anxious, reassuring presence on the street. So it seems very natural. It seems like it's what the church should be doing. And when you do what you should be doing, there's an element of celebration, but it's not really a time to feel overexcited about the fact that you're doing what you should be doing. So it's a very natural feeling. We're glad that we had the opportunity to be able to, and continue to have the opportunity to be able to make a difference, a significant difference on the streets at that time of night. So it's we give thanks to God, and we're grateful to those people that saw the vision when it was written down, according to Habakkuk, and they've run with it.
They've really run with it. To know that it's, you know, it's in Scotland, it's in England, it's down south, it's everywhere. And I think one of the things that struck me was that these were, as I said, everyday people. This was like Jill in accounting or, you know, they weren't like superheroes with capes. And and also there was this non-judgmental approach to speaking with people. And I remember there was a guy that we came upon, and he was totally inebriated, like completely gone, and he didn't know how to get home, and we actually had to walk him back. And there was a point where, because he was so intoxicated, he just ran across a street and nearly got run over, and I shouldn't laugh, but he ran across the street and nearly got hit by a car. And we kind of, if we weren't there, I don't know if that car would have hit him, because, you know, just a few seconds more, we were pulling him away, if you know what I mean. And I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, what if this service wasn't there? So it's a huge thing. And how long has it been going now? Oh,
it's nearly 20 years now. And you know, the funny thing is that you say what would happen if Street Pastors wasn't there. There's hundreds of stories of those kinds of interventions. People being stopped from being stabbed, ladies being stopped from being raped because they found themselves in a situation where they're vulnerable. But I think the other thing to point out is that is what you see on the streets is the consequence of 12 weeks of training. And it's the training that allows people to learn how to be present in a way that is constructive and in a way that is non-judgmental. They're trained in understanding their community, drugs awareness, and so on. And so that means people go out on the streets having gone through quite rigorous training for 3 months on Saturday, and they're out there doing what they do. So, like I said, it's excited to be a part of setting up the Street Pastors and to see the continuing impact it's having and the respect that it has on the streets across the country and beyond. Yeah, massive respect, especially from the police. Absolutely. They actually said that since it was going in that area, the number of incidents had gone down. Always happens, so, yeah, huge. I was actually doing some reading up on the original values of Street Pastors, and they're listed as the sacredness and sanctity of human life, valuing and honouring the community, being a person of integrity, taking personal responsibility, and growth and development of the individual to their fullest potential. And there's a quote from you that says, these must be combined with practical action. How closely do those values stem from your own core values as a person? Yeah, fundamentally. I mean, the whole idea of respecting human dignity is rooted in both a biblical and theological conviction. The biblical conviction and theological convictions that we're made in the image and likeness of God. But it's also rooted in my culture. In Africa, my parents are from Nigeria. We have a word on the continent of Africa called Ubuntu, and it's about what they call a subjective, interdependent understanding of yourself. So Ubuntu says, I'm only a person through other people. I can't exist in isolation. So that's fundamental in terms of our belief in community and the core values that were kind of set out in that agenda. So they're fundamentally personal views, but they're views that are shared across the Christian community, but also views that are shared across African and Caribbean communities as values that are fundamentally intrinsic to how we see ourselves and how we see other people. And I think if we're going to have an initiative that's going to be people focused, then it needs to be informed by a set of values and a set of practices that prioritize people. I had the privilege of growing up in a home that was very poor. My dad had a stroke when I was 1. My mum worked as a domestic cleaner in a local hospital. And so we didn't have the trappings of affluence to detract us from what we fundamentally believed. Because when your father or your husband has a double stroke, a heart attack, as well as a blood clot on the brain, you think quite quickly about what life means to you and what's important. And when he doesn't recover from that fully, but is able to develop some degree of autonomy and independence, those values are almost unconsciously passed on to your children. And so I say to people that I had the good fortune of, in the last 10 or so years, they've been talking about resilience. I'm like, I didn't have to be taught resilience. I lived with it every day. I saw a dad who had a stroke, learn to rewrite, learn to write again, learn to speak again, learn to get on the bus, learn to live a purposeful life without any complaints. I saw that for nearly 25, 30 years. So those core values that were intrinsic to my parents' existence as a result of their own trauma which was preceded by the death of a young child, informed my life from the get-go. So they were always telling us, don't be defined by this unfortunate set of circumstances because they're unique and particular to your father. And what you have to do is extract or extrapolate the best meanings that you can from that and to reframe the future so that you can live a full life. And so that was always the message we heard as children. And therefore we were always introduced to these core values. So I had the good fortune of being in a situation that was, in most people's eyes, quite tragic. But in our eyes, it helped us to crystallize the most important things in life. I look at my parents' life and I look at the trauma they went through and the kind of determination and the kind of indefatigable spirit they needed to possess in order to be able to cast a vision for 3 young boys, born into a tragic situation and where there was, very little resources. And to me, having that transmission means that I have a responsibility to do the best that I can with what I have, because I had much more than what they had and they did excellently. And so every good decision I make and every good action I make is not just about actualizing my potential. It's about living in honor of the way they lived and the values that they gave me.
I want to stick a little bit on your earlier years because, I mean, as you are now, you're a reverend, you sit on various charitable boards and, you do so much. But it wasn't always like that, was it? This is like the clean version.
No, no. You're not going there, are you?
Well, I just want to touch a little bit on how your earlier years framed you in the journey to this place.
I think the best word to define my early years, and to some degree the word that continues to provoke me to take action and to be resolute in the face of privileges and seductions that come with engaging with people in power, is anger. As a young man, you wonder, why the hell did this happen? Why are these 2 good people in a situation where they don't know whether they can afford food, they don't know whether they can afford electricity, and at a very tender age, my brother's having to ring the electricity company and the gas company to negotiate for my parents. You start to ask some serious questions. Why is nobody helping? Why have you got a family around you that are millionaires? Why is my mum's dad in the 1970s, every naira equaled a pound? He was a naira to pound millionaire.
In Nigeria?
He was in Nigeria.
Right, but that didn't translate over here.
No, every naira was equal to £1. So he was a millionaire in Nigeria. He was a millionaire over here, a multi-millionaire. But we were living in poverty.
Yeah, so how did that happen?
Well, he's dead now, and I don't know. But that's what I'm saying. These are the questions that when you're in a traumatic situation as a child and you realize that the world is not what it should be, you start to ask some big questions. And why is it that mum and dad are so generous and so accommodating and so loved, but nobody seems to be taking any notice of the material impact of this illness on dad's life? Why is it that people come to the house or the flat and they eat, but they never bring anything with them? So if you're talking about a young guy that had rage inside of him, I was that guy. And it manifested itself in all sorts of ways. I became very overly boundaried. And I went into therapy for about 4 years or so.
What do you mean when you say overly boundaried? Like what?
Well, I became inflexible. If I believe this, and I believe that you should do this or you shouldn't do that, if you cross that boundary, that's what you find at the other side you're not going to like. But I'm not going to apologize to you because you came across that boundary. But that was rooted in a lot of anger because the world wasn't as it should be. So I wanted to make the world how I wanted it to be. And because as a child, you're trying to create a vision of your world that is contrary to everything that you're experiencing, you have to invest a certain degree of resistance, a certain degree of inflexibility. Otherwise, one of the core things is I had to negotiate is threat. What does it mean for me as a child to have a dad that's disabled? Who's going to look after us? What does it mean when I hear that you're negotiating bills, or I'm hearing mum cry because she hasn't got money for that. There's no one to stand in the way of threat. So the best way to deal with threat is to let people know it shouldn't come to you. And if it comes to me, it'll be taken care of.
So there was always this, I suppose you have to put this armor on, don't you? To
Absolutely.
Kind of, it's almost like when you put the guard dog at the front of the shop to say, don't bother stepping over this threshold.
Absolutely. Fear, weakness, vulnerability, anger, just confusion. Why is the world as it is? Why are good people suffering in this way? And why are other good people not concerned about it? So, yeah.
How did that manifest into other realms such as education, fear, relationships, coming into your adult years as a young man? How did that present itself?
Very problematic, and it still remains problematic, but to a less extent. And that's the reality. I took myself into therapy to try and understand why I do what I do.
How old were you when you took yourself into therapy?
Probably 40, 45.
Okay, so you were...
I was
older.
Yeah, but it came to a head. And I took myself, my mum died, my brother died, and my dad died. And what was funny is that I just shook it off and carried on. Wow. And one day a friend of mine said to me, you need to think about therapy. And she was a therapist. And I said to her, you need a therapist more than I do, because I was just used to getting on with stuff. But I went into therapy and began to just explore different aspects of my life that I had found problematic. So as a teenager, you couldn't really, I was very nice because I was brought up in a very nice family, but everyone at school knew you just leave Dave alone. And if you decided to cross the boundary, I'd deal with it. On the road, I would deal with it. So I was the guy who everybody respected and had a degree of fear for, but I wasn't a bully. Because that was the other thing with threat. I was bullied when I was younger.
Okay.
In primary school. Because my mum told me never to fight, because my dad had a bad heart, and if I fought, he would get stressed and he would die. So I just let myself get beaten up. When I got to secondary school, I said, like, you know what, respect to mum, but I've had enough of this. And just started dispatching people left, right and center.
Dispatching?
Yeah, that's the way it had to be. So that's how it manifests. In relationships, always angry. My mum was a very lovely, seriously, everyone's mum is the best, but when people tell you that they've met her and that she's the best, she was the best. But it had a material impact on me. What does it mean when you're already in a situation of vulnerability where your mum seems to be preoccupied with everyone else apart from you? When she seems to be negotiating in psychotherapy her own deprivation by compensating and being overly generous, and you're suffering.
So who was she compensating to? Is that
everybody? She was in the church.
Right.
So every child in the church on their birthday got £5.
From your mum?
From my mum.
But you guys were at home struggling?
Yeah. And we're not getting... We would get our presents, our birthdays in August, we'd get our presents in September, October, but everyone got their presents on the day.
Oh, wow.
And then at Christmas, we would get our presents sometimes January and February, but everyone got a box of Maltesers. And we had to carry the Maltesers from the shop, wrap the Maltesers, and then carry them to church. And don't forget, we're still young at this point. So we don't want to be seen with mum's trolley on a Sunday morning taking sweets to everybody else.
David, I'm not going to lie, you're a better person than me, because I would have ate them.
All right.
Was that Christmas? Who? I would have eaten them, but praise the Lord.
Yes.
That you did that. But I suppose did that breed a sense of resentment sometimes?
Of course it does. Of course it does.
Yeah.
And the kids at church knew it, and she was a Sunday school superintendent. So if there was anyone that was remotely rude to her after Sunday school, you just give them 2 lashes. But that wasn't about them being rude. It was about I was negotiating my own stuff.
Yeah.
And that manifested into adult, young, teenage and adult relationships and relationships with people of the opposite sex. I was very violent. I couldn't care who you were. Wow. If I felt you crossed the boundary, then I went there. And those are things that I just had to come to terms with when I was older. And they're things that motivate me to be better and to be non-judgmental and to be empathetic and compassionate. when I deal with people, because good people have bad starts. And unless you work with them, you just perpetuate it with them.
This interview is actually a little bit of a full circle moment for me, because we met last year when I was interviewing Ricky, Pastor Ricky Otto, and we said our hellos and stuff, but didn't really get a chance to talk too much. And then earlier this year, I was at home, I think I was cooking, I was in the kitchen, and I was listening to the radio, and this man was talking, and he was giving his kind of, a testimony, I suppose, of his life, of what it was before he'd come to faith, before he'd come to Christ, and then afterwards. And I was just gripped into this story, and I was just like, who is this? And once it had finished, the presenter said, well, that was David Shosanya and I was like, oh, and I Googled you. Yeah. I was like, that's the guy I met, last year. And it kind of was like as I say, a full circle moment, because I had wanted to interview you from last year, and then hearing you talk, I was like, okay, I'm definitely going to get you on this show. But there was something that you said, and I hope you can recall in the interview, you talked about somebody had said something to your mum. Yeah. And it was kind of a damning statement. Absolutely. That didn't really leave you with anywhere to go in terms of growth. And it sounded to me, from what you said in that small snippet, that you just took it and ran with it. Do you remember what the statement was? Yeah,
it was someone, my mum, because I was getting off the kind of path that the parents had socialized me into. And my mum was asking people for prayer, because my life was getting more and more out of order. And she asked one person in particular that she considered to be a prophet. And he said, he's got a revelation that David's never going to make any contribution to life. He's destined for hell, and he's sad. And I happened to overhear the conversation. And I just thought to myself, if that's the case, if you're going to be the best that you can. I say that to young people often. I say, if you're going to be a Christian, be the best Christian you can. If you don't want to be, then just do everything else, and so I heard this and I thought, if that's the case, and he seems to be a respected guy, my mum was very emotional. I thought, let's go down that road, and let's do and that's when my life really began to change. I was doing 8 O-levels, and then before you knew it, I was doing my CSEs, and then I was doing City and Guilds, and then I was removed from classes, started to join a sound system. At the age of 15, I was invited into Frontline sound system by Trevor Frontline himself.
So obviously this is for those of us in the Midlands that might not know what Frontline is.
Oh yeah. Frontline was one of the most notorious sound systems across the UK, well respected in the 70s and 80s. Unfortunately, God rest his soul, Trevor Frontline passed away. But because of the skills that I learned in church, and because of the socialization coming from an African home, I learned to respect my elders and talk in a particular way. So I was the only person in what they call Frontline Junior, which is the younger brothers. Even though I didn't have a brother in Frontline, I could go to his house and get records and do all sorts of stuff. So I got involved in that, got involved in other sound systems. And then I was bigger than most of my friends. So they said, if I had a fight, I'll push David to the front. And because the poverty, it eroded my self-esteem, that statement. So we started to get into fights and started to, again, always fair, I would never bully anyone or pick on anyone. I was the one to defend you. But if it came on top and we had to go, then I was good to go, particularly if you'd done something wrong. And it just started to get out of control.
What were some of your strongest memories of that time period?
Do you know, it's a funny thing that I'm going to say to you. A theme that runs through my life and I have to manage today is the theme of anger. And I say it because that's my reality. And if I was to present anything else, I'd be lying. Yeah. But hopelessness was another one. But also frustration, because I've got these two consciousnesses in myself. I've got the consciousness of all that I've been taught and I believed and all that I've seen. And I've got a group of people around me in church and in community who are achievers. I grew up in a church that had a lot of people from Africa. They had something called the African Students Movement. So these guys were PhDs, and they're talking about 70s and 80s. They're PhDs, master's degrees, working in banks. and yet I'm saying to myself, I could never achieve that because of all that I've heard and all that I've been through.
That's been spoken over
Absolutely.
you as well. Yeah.
All the unconscious conditioning that taken place.
Yeah.
And so those emotions, anger, confusion, frustration, hopelessness, and yet the desire to dream and the utter paralysis that comes from the fear of just not daring to dream. It was horrible.
At what stage would you say that you became aware? So I know obviously you went to therapy in your 40s, but before that, because you said that, you know, your closest passed away and you just kicked on and carried on and doing. Before going to therapy and at that stage in your life, where did you become aware that something's not right? Like, or that, you know, things, you were operating in a way that wasn't, I suppose, conducive to.
Wow, yeah, I was always aware, but the big change was, it was September 1983. The last Sunday in September, I can't remember the date. Me and my friends were in a park and a guy came walking through the park, and so I don't know what happened. And we, you know, when you're young, you think this park belongs to us. It belongs to the local authority, but you think you're the marshals and that. So we're in our park, and this guy walks through, and they're telling him, I don't even know what happened. And he was a workman. He had a bag of tools with him, and he was saying, look, there's some altercation that happened. And I was always a peacemaker, let him go and that kind of. But this guy, because he had this bag of tools and everything, he was a bit brave, and he had a bit of self-confidence. And in the end, we ended up attacking him, and it wasn't a good sight at the end. And we all ran off from the scene because somebody called the police. I ran to a friend's house who then drove me home in a car, and you could hear the sirens and everything going. I was in the car, man, back of the car, I'm like, it's not making no sense. I was at church on Sunday. My parents are good people. I'm a good person. But all this insecurity, because when, and I think a lot of people come from poverty might understand this. You got family, but it's not the kind of secure base that you need. So you want to belong to something. So I'm thinking to myself, what the hell is going on? Why am I? And I don't want to hate people. I actually love people. I actually like them. And so that was really a point when I began to think, this life is not for me. And it got to a point where I got so angry that I thought to myself, you know what? This is when guns and that were just beginning to come in. I just thought, my friends wouldn't let me near a gun. So I can understand why. I'm not saying I condone it, but I understand why people end up shooting people. Because there's such a sense of they're empty. And then you want to put disrespect on the emptiness. The only thing I could do is to assert absolute power, because I'm absolutely powerless. So bang, bang. So at that point, I thought, if I start getting into this gun thing, it's not going to be good. Yeah. So at that point, I just started to think, talk to God. People are praying for me. Strangely enough, the next week, the 3rd of October, 1983, I gave my life to Christ under the ministry of Les Isaac, and that completely revolutionized my life.
Even in all of that time that you, I suppose, were losing your way, and having everybody said what they'd said over you, you still had an awareness of God that... Yeah,
more than awareness.
Would you say it was guiding you?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because it was
It's okay. It's all right.
Yeah, man. Yeah, it was more than awareness of God. Thank you. Do you know Isaac Newton talked about amazing grace? It was that. It was I always knew God's grace. I remember being in a house where a friend of mine and the police came and they raided the house and took everybody away, and I don't know why, for some reason they let me go. Little things, I just saw the grace of God in little ways. People always gave me opportunities. So it was more than just a sense of God's, kind of presence. It was actually providence. God was moving things around. I was meeting people that had confidence in me and talked about my potential and stuff like that. So my tears are not about sadness. They're about a recognition of a real grace of God in my life.
I think that's interesting because I often, I've been in church myself and some, the music can be lifting me or whatever, and I'm just suddenly flooded by tears, and it's not a sadness, is it? It's I remember where I was, and to know where I am now, that's not by any doing of my own.
Absolutely.
That's the grace of God that you're talking about. So I understand the emotion. Yeah,
and it's strange because I was asking myself, should I tell this part of my story? Should I not? And in 2018, I went through a divorce. And I was the kind of, what do you want, not the golden child, everybody knew you and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And you go from high flying, as it were, and you end up, it doesn't matter, you get the wind knocked out of you.
Yeah.
And it was messy and acrimonious.
How long were you married?
Nearly 22 years.
Yeah, so that's a long time.
And like I said, you get the wind knocked out of you, and you see all sorts of things happen. You start to realize that there are some friends that are transactional. As long as you could do something for them, they're present. And then you get some friends who are just ride or die. It doesn't matter what goes on. But I got to a point where I came out of the house and I had nothing because I didn't take anything, because that's what was in my spirit. And then I look where I am today. 4 years later, some people say, you go through a divorce, your people lose their mind, people, do all sorts of stuff. And I look and I think, this is strange. I set up a business because I thought I've got some skills. And then I've never had to do tendering for a contract. And I've worked with some big organizations. And you see the hand of God. And God said, and I say to people, I talk to a lot of people who get divorced, a lot of people who go through a breakdown or something. And I say to them, look, while you're breathing, you've got the responsibility to live. That's what push comes to shove. If you're breathing, you've got the responsibility to live. And again, with that, I see the providence and the grace of God. It's always been there in different ways.
The responsibility to live. That's interesting. I've never heard that I've never heard it said how you've just said it. And I wonder if you could expand on that some more, because when you say the response, people, we get up, we naturally breathe and exude oxygen or whatever all day. But having the responsibility to live, to exist in this world is much more than just taking in a breath and
absolutely
sending it back out. What do you mean when you say that?
Again, it's one of the things that my bio says, that I like to see people dissolve in self-imposed limitations. It's the privilege of growing up in poverty. You don't get that if you grow up in privilege. So what I learned, you're asking me to explain something that we lived as a family, so I could do it easily. My dad was a very disciplined man, even with his stroke. He was never late to church, and our church was a 15-minute bus ride from home. When you took your right hand of fellowship, they said you must be in your seat 15 minutes before the service. This is a man with a stroke who traveled 50 minutes, and he was always in church 15 minutes before the service. He was disciplined in his food. He was disciplined. I never heard him, literally never heard him grumble about his illness. And he was sick for 20 something years. 30 years, from 38 to 68. I never heard him speak a bad word about anybody. I said, Dad, why? And he said, I get the privilege. I'm still here to see you and your brothers and your mum develop and live. So what he taught me, it wasn't a kind of philosophical lesson like sit down with Plato or Socrates or somebody like that. his lifestyle taught me that actually, while I've got one leg working and one arm working and slurred speech, I've got the responsibility to move. I've got the responsibility to be in your life. So when my brother was in hospital, he would travel at night on a bus to a very, hospitals are big grounds, and he would travel on his own with his walking stick on a bus, 15, 20 minutes. So that's what I mean by the responsibility to live. It wasn't a philosophy that someone taught me. It was the way my dad lived, the way my mum lived. This life of ours has imploded, but we're still going to make the best out of it. And that's the way I try to live my life.
I think what you've said about your dad is actually really important, because I wanted to actually talk to you about, so he seemed to give you a sense of responsibility in life, but I also wanted to talk about how watching your parents helped, even though you're going through all this turmoil, this anger, this frustration, how that formed your identity. Because often when we say the Black community, I think from outside, it can sound quite homogenous.
Absolutely.
So like we're all the same, but we actually have different experiences. And for yourself growing up as a young Black man from an African family, be very different from a young Black man growing up in a Caribbean family.
Absolutely.
How did that help shape your identity as well, as whilst you were kind of mingling with the rest of the community and seeing life for what it was in other areas?
Yeah, I think two things instinctively. The first was language. When I got home and I stepped over the threshold of the door, my parents would speak in Yoruba.
Yeah.
So even if my white friends came to the house, they would get a dose of Yoruba before they left, because that was the language that was spoken, and they would kind of remind themselves that this person doesn't speak Yoruba. Now that's powerful, because there's something called neuro-linguistic programming. It's the way language works with your brain and how the neurons and dendrites fuse together to create neural pathways through something called synaptic activity. So the unconscious mind is about the way we think about things, and the way we think about things, we use words. So you've got the language part, but you've got the neurological part, and this neuro-linguistic programming is the way language forms in our mind to help us to see reality.
Right.
So my parents speaking Yoruba to me gave me a completely different reference point to the English language. So I'll give you an example. My English friends, if they upset their parents, they say, look, Johnny, if you don't behave yourself, I'll give you a smack on your backside. My mum will say, which means if you don't fall into place, I'm going to slap you so hard that your ears will crumble and just dissolve off the side of your face. There's a force there.
I can relate. It was,
oh, come on, yeah.
If you don't behave yourself, I'm going to box you into tomorrow.
There you go.
Yeah.
Now, what I'm saying is, when you've got a whole language system that constantly correlates these concepts together, it gives you an alternative reference point for the world. And so my identity, or as a Black young man, wasn't just about the way I used English language. It was about the way I connected myself to the continent of Africa through the language that my parents spoke and through the practices that they embodied within the home. So that was one thing that made my identity quite secure. I didn't have some of the anxieties that some of my Caribbean friends had that didn't have the benefit of that neuro-linguistic programming in the flat. The second thing was, I talked earlier about being part of a sound system. Now, today, music can be quite derogatory to women, and it can be, quite dismissive and angry and violent. Not all music, but some. A lot of the music that's shaping the mind and the consciousness of young people. Not in my day. You had Dennis Brown. Do you know what it means to fight a revolution? All those songs. Now, they gave us, again, a sense of identity. All these guys telling us about Babylon, so we understand politics.
It was conscious, wasn't it?
There you go.
Bob Marley, all those
absolutely.
people.
Bob Marley, all the Wailers, all sorts of people. Now, that gave us, we were being unconsciously socialized, racialized in a society where you had stop and search and all the other things, and you know about the special schools. But when we were in sound system, we had artists that strung together words with the kind of anthropological power of music. That you don't, when you play music, you don't have to have words. It gets to your spirit. But these guys put words, and these women put words on top of it. And they gave us an understanding of what it meant to be black. And for me as an African child who was growing up in England in the 70s with very few other African families, it was the Caribbean community that, the Bible says Jesus escaped into Egypt and he found a refuge there. He said, from Egypt, I called my son. People often say that I'm a Jamaican Nigerian simply because in that culture where there was very few people from my parents' culture, or at that time, that historical period, there was very few people that I could align myself with the Caribbean community offered me a perspective on what it meant to be black that was different to my African perspective. So I've got multiple perspectives, and there are multiple communities. We're not a homogeneous group. We're a collection of communities with different cultures, different languages, different practices, and so on.
Wow. Okay. Wow. I wonder then how that, fast forward, has continued in your faith journey.
Yeah.
Because what I'm taking away from what you said is you were able to remove the boundaries, basically, not be confined to the constraints of
Absolutely
the colonial way of thinking and all that kind of stuff. And so transcend what the invisible walls are to say, you should act and behave in this manner within this realm. And I think that faith is very much the same, because it requires us to step into a way of believing and thinking beyond what we can see, beyond what society and the world is telling us. How do you relate the two from the journey then to where you are now?
The big thing is, for me, I've managed to allow some of the, I talked a bit about Pan-Africanism. What you find with Christianity is that with Islam, it's both a faith and a political system. Sharia law, Islamic State. With Christianity, what we have is and that is spoken. With Christianity, what you have is a philosophical system, or at least a theological system, but there is an assumed Western political model that informs it, but there's not an alternative model. And I think we need to have a political philosophy that informs the way we do our faith, because we're living in the real world and we can't just come with abstract ideas. So we need to have some sort of political model that allows us to mediate elements of our faith through. And so for me, my African consciousness and my disposition towards Pan-Africanism means that I've now got this political model as a filter through which I could funnel my faith. So whiteness and blackness matter, because Pan-Africanism tells me that there are constructs of blackness in Black History Month that are pathological and that disenfranchise our community and prevent us from doing some things. Now, don't forget, I don't see racism, black people as just a victim of racism. I see white people as a victim of racism too. That's
interesting. In fact, you carry on, because I would like to know how you've come to that, because I saw you said something about that before as well. So yeah. Let
me just say it quickly, because the person who is being dehumanized and the person who is dehumanizing are both living well below their potential as human beings, made in the image and likeness of God. And that's why Martin Luther King's message is quite powerful, because he says, if someone is hating, you love them. Because he's saying, through the process of love, you maintain your own humanity, but you offer the possibility of a reconstructed humanity to the person that's seeking to dehumanize you. So it becomes a very powerful way of engaging with the world, and a powerful way of engaging with other people. So my kind of disposition towards Pan-Africanism means that I take color seriously, I take culture seriously.
So I just want to make sure that I've definitely understood what you said, because from what you're saying, it sounds as though what you're saying is that you do not see your Christian faith and your black identity as separate vehicles. Absolutely. They are intrinsically the same together. One informs the other.
Absolutely.
And that is how you move through life, affirming yourself through your Black identity and your Christian faith. Is that right?
Absolutely. And if I don't, what happens is I take on board and internalize, and people impose on me historical projections of who they think I am.
As a black person.
As a black man. And that is a denial of the finished work of Christ, because he frees me to be the best possible human being I can be, whether I'm white, black, yellow, male, female, able-bodied, whatever. He frees us to be the best that we can. But what happens a lot of the time when it comes to Black Christians, we're asked to leave behind our blackness and our Black experience. But then you may find that people are not asked to leave behind their imperialistic or their empire view of Christianity that actually leads to the oppression that we're experiencing. And I'm saying, no, I will assert my blackness and my identity because it's God-given, and because it's God-given, it's blessed. And it's to be a blessing to you.
Yeah, so it's nothing to shy away from.
Absolutely.
Yourself, you speak on many different platforms and stages, and I suppose that, as I said, the easiest thing to think about when I see you is, okay, I'm going to ask David to speak on his black male experience on this platform, or what you might have experienced as a young person, anger, frustration, etc. But I wonder if sometimes that can reduce the effect of the humanistic side of the wider journey. You know, so in your case, I should say, how do you manage to find relative qualities and synergy with people from other communities that aren't necessarily Black, aren't necessarily African or Caribbean, and outside of the faith and culture? Because your ethos through your company is about getting rid of the limitations that people place on themselves. So how do you manage to draw from all that you've been through and all who you are and relate to anyone? Yeah.
I think a couple of things. Empathy. I try to listen to people's story. People often say to me, how did you hear that? And I say, I listened to you. If you listen to people, you hear what perhaps they don't want to tell you. So I try to be empathetic. I try to be compassionate. But there's a guy called Dr. Goffman. He's a world expert on marriage. He said that any relationship, any problem you experience in any relationship is rooted around three things: power and control, care and concern, reward or recognition. Power and control, care or concern, and reward or recognition. Okay. And so I reduce down the complexity of human beings I try to reduce it to those three couplets. Because if me and you have an argument, we're either talking about power and control, care and concern, reward or recognition. So I reduce it down to manageable chunks. And I try to identify which couplet we're dealing with at the moment. So if I'm talking to a husband and a wife that may not be getting on, I'm probably talking about primarily care and concern, but that might manifest in terms of power and control, and ultimately reward and recognition.
I was going to say, should we try an experiment with me? But actually, no.
Why not?
I'll stick to my job. I think that's interesting. And you know what? I don't know why this is coming to me. I'm thinking of someone who's probably not reconciled with their experience. Yeah. And all I keep seeing is Will Smith slapping Chris Rock. Yeah. And I wonder if what you've talked about, you know, because he spoke on a little bit on that, where he hadn't reconciled his experience as a child, seeing his father not protecting his mom and all that kind of stuff. And so it manifested negatively in a very public setting. Is that an example of when it's gone the wrong way, would you say? Or have I got that right?
No, it's an extreme example.
Yeah.
Because he hasn't reconciled. But you see, in that situation, it's a good example. He's not only navigating his own thoughts, emotions, and experiences, he's navigating the thoughts, emotions, and experiences of Jada. And he's navigating the thoughts, emotions, and experiences of everyone in the room. What is it? So what you've got now is at least 2 or 3 layers of the same thing happening simultaneously. So he's completely overreacted. Whereas if he had mastered his own emotions and his own thoughts and had taken into consideration a different view and reframed his experiences, that moment could have passed and he could have said to Chris Rock after, that was a bad call. He wouldn't have slapped him. And it's a perfect example. It happens all the time. And that's where we're talking again now. That's care and concern.
Right.
He's saying you weren't caring for me in that situation.
Yeah.
You didn't show any concern.
Yeah.
So my unreconciled thoughts, emotions, and experiences manifested against my knowledge, my talent, my skill, the action I should have taken, and the responsibility I should have, and I acted in a way that was inconsistent with who I am.
Right. That's interesting. It's quite interesting actually when you think about how it's such a simple concept, but it goes
Absolutely
so deeply into the layer and core of the person, and how our behaviours actually come from sometimes not having reconciled our experiences.
Always from not having reconciled. It's a very serious thing, and that's one thing I learned in counselling was whether you accept it or not, it's there. Once you accept it, it has no power over you because it's neither right nor wrong. It's how you move forward. Most people spend most of their time deflecting from the truth, repressing it. And in doing that, they disempower themselves from actually being courageous enough to engage what's in front of them. So even this weekend, I said to somebody, I was talking to somebody and they had a challenge, and I said to them, they wanted to get out of the situation. I said, just sit there. Just allow yourself to feel what you're feeling, because the answer's in the feeling.
I don't know why I'm about to say this, but I'm going to say this because so I was actually having a conversation with my sister this morning. Yeah. And we talked about we were talking for a long time, and then at the end of it, I think I was like, we were giving thanks. Yeah. And I was just saying, I'm thankful for this time that we've had. But I think thinking on it now, I immediately closed myself off. So my body language had come to a point of, I can't be too vulnerable. Yeah. And so we started to, she called it out, quite rightly. And as we unpacked it, it came to a thing where I understood that I have a need to feel safe. And sometimes in being vulnerable, I don't feel safe in my emotions. And I wonder have I reconciled my experiences then, or would it be that I'm still in that place because I'm guarding myself, if you know what I mean? Yeah,
back to the couplets. The first question I would ask you is, how do you handle power and control? Because what you're talking to me about is power and control.
Right, okay.
You called it vulnerability, and it was, but it's actually power and control. So the question that I will start to tease out is, what is it about power and control? Why do you feel the need to be in control? Why do you feel that vulnerability is a threat? And then you start to unearth it from there. And I do that with myself. Yeah. So you can speak to anyone on that level. This show is called The Social Corner, as you know. And it's all about really digging into how individuals are affecting their corner for social change. Thinking on yours, how do you want to see it evolve in the next 5 years, so to speak? I told you that my greatest honor is to be an encourager. I would like to be more, you can be a verbal encourager, you can be financial encourager. I want to grow the capacity. It's one of my daily affirmations that I want to grow the capacity. No, I will grow the capacity to develop a Black philanthropic network. That network doesn't only support Black people. That network supports anybody, but it redefines the landscape in terms of philanthropy rather than charity with in reference to the Black community and Black business people. So I would like to develop and accumulate copious amounts of wealth with a view to disseminate that wealth to make other people's dreams possible in the way that people have made my dreams possible. The Bible begins by saying, go and multiply. So I want to see my encouragement multiply so that I can exponentially, so that I can continue to create opportunities. I already do it now, but I'd love to see opportunities for other people, and then provoke other people to be generous because of the generosity that they've received. So if I can achieve that, and I'm already doing it, but I want to achieve it at a bigger scale, then I'd be happy to die encouraging people to do better by other people. That'd be good enough for me.
We're not saying you're going to die in 5 years.
No. But you know what? It's funny. I say to people, with all the stuff I've been through, I say to people, you know, if I drop dead tomorrow, you shouldn't really cry. I've had the most amazing life.
Wow.
I've been all over the world. I've been into crazy place. I can't. The only place I haven't been to in this country, significant place, is probably Buckingham Palace. But I've had dinner in some crazy places, met some crazy people. So I've had a good life, but that's not the point. The point is, how do you translate those positive stories and experiences and interactions into a movement that lifts people and releases them into their destiny? And that's the puzzle. That's the part of the puzzle that I'm investing in to get in place with other people.
Well, I definitely feel you've given us a part of the puzzle today.
It's been a pleasure.
And your wisdom, and just hearing you speak, having you come and speak to me has been very inspiring.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much
for coming on the show.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.